Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out. I'm Karen McMullen. I'm a senior programmer here, and it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and the amazing director of this film, Lisa Cortés.
Thank you, Karen. One of the hardest working programmers, brilliant tastes and minds out there. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Lisa. That means a lot coming from you. So, well, let's back to your beginning. You started off as a hip hop executive, and you've gone on to start, since to document many aspects of Black American life, both in music and out, the Apollo and astronauts and hip hop and fashion. Just talk about what, led you to Little Richard.
Well, music is so important to kind of my own structural integrity. I've been singing and performing since I was very young. And I am increasingly concerned about making visible stories that many forces in this country would like to make invisible, whether they're Black stories or queer stories. And when Little Richard passed away, the more I learned about him, I realized that he presented the opportunity to not just look at and give him his flowers, but to also zoom out and to engage our audience, hopefully, in a broader conversation about what has been omitted from the narrative and the tremendous impact of those individuals, not only just on music, but in this case with Richard, on culture.
Yeah, I know when I was a kid, when my mother got tired of hearing us, our Parliament and Rick James and whatever we were playing on the stereo, she'd take back the turntable and put on a stack of 45s, and she'd play the Shirelles and Wilson Pickett and Little Richard. And we always really liked Little Richard, even as little kids. And I just want you to speak to the universal appeal of him and what chord you think he touches in people.
Well, one of the brilliant things that our editor, Nenev, who is here, and also our other collaborative editor, Jay Kostetter, leaned into was performance and really spending time with the tremendous archival that had been assembled to sit with those really gripping moments of performance, and to make certain that it was integrated into the film in a way that it contributes to a very, I think, immersive experience, not just about the performance, but about the emotionality that Richard is bringing. Trying to drill into the interiority of his character was what was appealing, but was also challenging because there are many different Richards, but it's that roller coaster ride that he takes us on, whether he's the Bible-selling Richard or the sex, drugs, and rock and roll Richard, or the Richard discovering community when he is kicked out of his family at a young age. Those are, it's the invisible thread that we're continuously pulling on, to go on this wild ride.
And I this is the second or maybe the third time I've seen it. And you have this theme of him. Of course, he's a star, but he's kind of bigger than a star. Maybe you called him, I think, once a supernova. And at the end, he's sprinkling his magic all over the industry and artists. Can you talk a little bit more about that theme?
Well, when we think about Richard, he's elemental, and he's like the Big Bang appearing in our lives. We had a lot of conversations about alchemy, magic, his DNA, and where we now see it residing on contemporary artists. And it was a great challenge to find a visual vocabulary that spoke to what did it feel like when you heard Tutti Frutti? What did it look like when he just, meets these different people and has this tremendous impact? So that, I think, was a lot of fun to translate feelings into visual motifs, and working with our wonderful graphics person, Fawn Schneiden, just finding these elements and tropes that appear throughout the film, even the activation of the energy. That's that residue of the Big Bang that Richard is then activating within himself as he is seen, but then also sharing with others through the course of the film.
I always think how much fun it must be to be privy to this archive. We only see a little bit of what you find as you're making the film. Can you talk about, well, can you share any stories that didn't make it to the final cut about Mr. Little Richard?
Well, is Gideon here? Yay! So when we started the film, we reached out to Gideon and Rich Remsburg and said, we're going to try to make this film about Little Richard, and we'd like to know everything that's out there. And so Gideon, who's an incredible archival producer, researcher, and Rich, did this really broad sweep and gave us with like the building blocks of the archival, especially because I wanted to center Richard's voice to tell the story. And what didn't make it? Oh, of course, the things you can't afford, the things you can't fair use. And, you know, it's not an archival piece, but I was interested in the early mechanics of the music business. We allude to it a little bit in terms of, you know, he sold his master to, you know, Tutti Frutti for a very low $250 price. And, you know, then we kind of allude to it later when he pickets ATV. But so there was a conversation about how deals were done, and what happened to so many artists early in their career, in the case of the Rolling Stones, because, you know, they don't own the rights to their first album. ATCO does. But also, in general, what that ecosystem was looking like in a, you know, really onerous way for African American artists. So we didn't go down that rabbit hole, but I do think what happened to Richard led to a lot of bitterness for him, and I wish we could have shared more of that context, but it became a little bit too educational and distracting from kind of the impetus that we were going for.
Do you think there's been a correction? Because his story, this isn't the only story we've heard of people being ripped off by the music industry. Do you feel like that's still going on?
I think as long as there are artists who are hungry for opportunity and don't listen to people on their team who tell them to have an attorney look at things, that's going to happen. And, you know, I think there are just unscrupulous people out there who take advantage of the great desire for fame, understandably, that someone has after working so hard for so long.
I first saw this in Berlin, and it was very well received there, obviously. Can you talk about the difference, if you've noticed any difference screening it in America with international audiences, with the Black audiences, you know? I just came back from IDFA yesterday in Holland, and met a lot of international documentarians and buyers. It's interesting that so many people knew the music. Everyone's like, oh, I didn't know all these aspects of the story. But everyone seems to tap into the joy. You know, there was one time that Nenev tried an ending for the film that instead of using Corey performing Tutti Frutti, it was Tutti Frutti as performed in a variety of languages, which was kind of fun. I mean, maybe we can do something unofficially on YouTube or something, because he's been so like his impact. What I've learned is quite universal. And whether you're a filmmaker, a drag performer,
a human rights activist. I've heard from so many people who look to Richard as this incredibly moving, transgressive voice that empowered them. And I think that's what has been a great joy. And, you know, working with Magnolia and CNN, this film has had the opportunity to not only be the opening night film at Sundance, to have theatrical distribution here and around the world, and to now be moving towards our Max premiere on Thanksgiving Day. So if you're wondering what to do after you eat all that food, and you want to make up for what we have done to Indigenous people, you should make your family watch Little Richard.
Will do. I'm going to open it up to the audience. Do you have any questions for Lisa?
I'm just curious. I know I don't remember her name. I know he had a long time. He was married at one point and then had a long time, I guess, romantic partner, female one. Did he have any long time male romantic partners?
Nobody who was willing to speak. So that the Lee Angel is the woman you're referring to. And then, of course, Miss Ernestine, who he was married to. And Miss Ernestine, we had finished the film, and she tracked us down and said, I heard you're making this film. I don't want to be on camera, but there are some things that were really important to Richard that I'd love to have the opportunity to say. So our other producer, Karen, who's sitting here, helped us to get someone like Zoom. We got to get this done because we were under a lot of pressure, and to do an audio recording and to incorporate Miss Ernestine. But it's unfortunate that you know, we know that Richard's life was filled with arrests and all sorts of places that one might go to find comfort. As my mother would say, never finding comfort. I was like, no, they were cruising at the bathhouse, Mom. And there were just, you know, to find people who were willing to go on record was part of the mystery of his story.
Any other questions?
More a thought, I suppose. Congratulations and thank you. I love the image of like the physics, sort of his DNA moving through, but also like stars begetting stars, begetting light or something. You know, that moving forward. I think it's very inspiring. I had no idea about that era of the like right before he sees the vision. What year is that? When he sees the Sputnik or the star?
That is the late 50s. It's right after he's had this kind of, you know, incredibly impressive moment of hits. And so he's going to Australia to perform there. And, you know, I think it's also, there's a lot of pressure. And it all comes together with thinking, you know, the world's going to come to an end, which is so much in keeping with his upbringing. You know, like if you're dancing with Satan too much, you're going to bring about. Because what I've learned about the Adventist religion is it is a religion that believes that the second coming, you know, Revelations, is going to happen very soon. It's not you know, centuries from now. So I think when you are doing things that, according to your upbringing, are supposed to bring about this tremendous cataclysmic event, and you know, he's living the fast life. He's living in California, and you know, all that comes with it. I think it really kind of brought on for him this trauma of like, oh, I got to get out of this now.
I think tragic because right before he's so full of light and so inspiring. Really, his voice, I think, is very present. In other words, his messages that seem very appropriate for the day of sort of be who you are and you got this and all this great positivity and inspiration. Fascinating and paradoxical figure.
Well, it's a great tragic comedy, you know, the journey that he went on.
Mm.
Really random question. When he flew to Australia, because it's such a long flight, did he fly first class?
Well, he wasn't on Alaska Airline. That much I know. I can't imagine that he did, but I don't know exactly.
It's a long flight, so I figured maybe they bumped him up or something.
Thinking when I was growing up, my first big music guy that I loved was Prince, and over Michael Jackson, and love both of them, of course. And my parents saying, "There ain't nothing. Look at James Brown, and look at Little Richard." I did see one night James Brown performing. They said, "Oh my God, that's what Prince does." And it wasn't until I was in college that I saw Little Richard. They said, "Oh my God, that's what Prince does. That's what Michael does." Did you talk to their estates about anything from Prince and Michael Jackson and the influence he had on them? Was it not possible to do? I'm sure you had the same thoughts, of course. You have so many other people who are great and influenced by him. I'm just curious about those two superstars.
Are you talking more about like someone from the estates who could talk about their?
Or footage maybe you found of them talking about Richard that you couldn't get to.
No, I think it was really important to keep it. If there's voices, they have to be voices that are supporting what Richard is telling us, and sometimes the voices that are in the film, the different, whether it's the scholars or the friends and family musicians, are correcting a narrative that Richard puts out because he's not always the most credible narrator. Yeah. There is a little nod to Michael Jackson with John Branca, who's in the film, who was Michael's attorney. And in Richard's autobiography, he talks about how when Michael bought the ATV catalog that had the Beatles songs, that had specialty records, he gave Richard money. And so that was a part of interviewing John Branca that we didn't bring all of that in. I was saying before about the mechanics of the music industry. But John Branca did confirm, we have it on the record, that Michael Jackson actually did give Richard money just because he recognized what he owed to Richard and also how Richard, had not received the correct remuneration for the value of his work.
Thank you so much for talking about this film. There are a couple moments where you showed these kind of shorter performances by contemporary musicians. The one that you mentioned that I was really struck by was when Corey Henry played Tutti Frutti. And I wanted to ask about that because when it started, it was kind of covering that part of the story where he went into the bar across the street and played on the piano. And when it first cut to the piano, I almost expected it to be like a recreation or something, but it felt by having Corey Henry play and just play it as himself, it felt like a very intentional deviation from that, at least for me. So kind of curious about what the thought was behind that and the other performances throughout the movie.
So the question is about the what I call the dreamscapes with Valerie June, Corey Henry, and Pastor John P. Key. When I pitched this film, I always wanted to have what I call these kind of magic realism moments, portals of possibility that Richard is able to move through, that actually we use as a device to expand the notion of the energy of the particles. And, we've seen a lot of cradle to grave music, biodocs, and there's a desire that I hope comes through with this film to shake things up, to kind of break down the fourth wall, have this immersive experience, and we're very clear that they're not recreations, and that's why the artist's name is there, etc. But they were chosen because they are part of his legacy. Every one of those artists, we didn't have to say, oh, could you do this? They were like, when? They kind of feel that he gave them permission for their own creative growth. And so, so much of Richard's story is about an expanded imagination that propelled him to not only present in a particular way, but to fuse the music and be himself in a space that no one else was occupying like he did. And so those interstitial dreamscapes are also a part of the expanded imagination that I feel Richard gave to all of us, and we wanted to honor in the making of the film. I think many times there were things that we were testing the boundaries, and it was kind of like, well, what would Richard do? Mm-hmm. And it was like, yeah, he'd say go for this, and that's what we would lean into. Thank you.
It's so awesome to hear you talk about your film, but we are out of time. I wanted to give you just the opportunity to share anything else with the audience you'd like them to know about your film.
Well, we just got nominated for a Grammy. So if there are any Grammy voters in the room, I'll buy you a popcorn. But I never bought you the popcorn. You know how that goes. So we're excited to be in the running for Best Music Film. And then once again, on Thanksgiving, November 23rd, the film will be on Max. And if you really, really love it and want to buy it, it's available on platforms like Amazon and Apple, Google Play, etc. We have a soundtrack, and it's currently on Spotify. This week, the CDs will be available, and at the top of next year, there will be vinyl, and it will be in tutti frutti colors.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Best of luck.
Thank you.
with the
Thank you
film.
so much, Karen. And thanks to the incredible volunteers at Doc NYC.